see my screen all right?
Yes.
Can you see that? Great. Amazing. Well, thanks everyone for having me. As I say, it's quite nice to be able to give a talk at Sheffield Uni. So I do come from Sheffield, but have been now in Bath just over 10 years. So I did my part 1, 2 and 3 at Bath Uni. And yeah, as Mimi said earlier, I've now spent pretty much all my time since then working on this one project. So for the last 4 and a bit years, I've been working on the technical design and then construction phase of this project. So we're in the last few months now, 2 or 3 months left of this project. So it's kind of coming together. But it's been in the formation for pretty much around 10 years or so. It's been a very long project, 3 years on site, but Bath being a World Heritage City, trying to get permissions on even like a domestic extension can be pretty complicated. So a large scale renovation extension project like this on the Abbey just took a huge amount of research and time to put into it. So it's all kind of local design teams. So Feilden Clegg Bradley's the architects, Bureau Hapon and the engineering man Williams on the structures. Yeah, I'll do a kind of little brief intro, a little bit to the city and the Abbey for those of you who maybe haven't been around. In terms of the project as a whole, so the footprint project's £20 million project. About half of that or so is construction value, and it's mainly around securing the Abbey floor. That's the primary aspect of it, but then there's a whole range of extension parts of it and renovation to basically prepare the Abbey for the next sort of 100 years or so. There's just quite a few of the additional areas around the Abbey were in really poor state and required a huge amount of work. So the project is mainly ensuring that it's a vibrant church for its congregation, but also for its use in the wider city in the 21st century. So those of you who have been to Bath, or maybe those of you who've been following the Bridgerton series on Netflix and might be recognising some of these buildings. So most people know it to be the Georgian city, and obviously it's mainly sort of recognised for that. That's why it's got its World Heritage City status through its works of people like John Wood and Ralph Allen, like the Georgian Circus and the crescent that you can see in the top left and bottom right there are kind of key sort of landmarks. They're well known. But obviously it's also known for being a Roman city. The whole reason that the city started was around the Roman baths, the thermal baths that we'll talk about in a moment. But there is some aspects in the city that are kind of fit in between the Roman and the Georgian period, and the Abbey obviously being the kind of pinnacle of that, sitting right in the centre. So Bath Abbey is, well, the current building is around 500 or so years old, so it's Gothic perpendicular style, although a lot of that work that we can see, for example, like the fan vaulting on the left there, that was actually Victorian sort of addition. So it's been worked on and changed since then, but the main building is 500 years old, but it sits on the site of a Norman cathedral, and that on top of a Saxon church where first King of England, King Edgar, was crowned in 973. So sort of historically, it's sort of built on many layers. It's kind of been a centre of faith in the city of Bath for hundreds of years. And this just kind of gives a bit of context of where the Abbey, which is sort of circled in red there, and the Roman baths, which are circled in blue, how they just sit within the context of the Georgian city, but actually how the Georgian city also is still very much based on the medieval and the Roman city. So what you see in the red boundary there is the old, it's the Roman walls of the city with the kind of north, south, east, west sort of axis going through it, and the gates that you could see there, that's still kind of very much the kind of contemporary Georgian city still follows that arrangement. And yeah, the whole reason that this city kind of started building itself up was because the Romans set up the Roman baths complex. Bath is the only place where you have a natural thermal spring that rises up from the ground that's hot. So obviously you have thermal springs, sorry, you have natural springs coming out elsewhere in the UK. This is the only place where you have warm water coming up. So there's a whole bath complex, but also a whole sort of temple complex as well, where the Abbey is at the moment. The Roman baths itself has sort of a huge amount of visitors and really good facilities in terms of visitor experience. As people come to the city to visit the Roman baths and see what's why the history and context of the city. And the Bath Abbey gets a huge amount of visitors as well, about 500,000 or so a year, but has nowhere near the kind of level of facilities for visitors as the Roman baths. So a key part of this project is basically allowing the Abbey to open its doors to all the visitors that come to it in the year, but to give them a really good experience, sort of on par with the Roman baths. And there's a key sort of link between the two buildings in this project. So as I said, the hot water spring rises up in this location. Obviously, all that hot water that comes out from the ground has to go somewhere. So there's about 1 million litres a day that rise up in the Roman baths complex, just down the bottom left of the image. And the Romans actually built a drain that takes the hot water and the excess hot water away. So that's the kind of orange line that you can see there, which is now, just because of the layers of the city that have been built up, that's the Roman drain is about 8 meters or so below street level, but it is quite a substantial structure, and it takes the hot water that comes out 45 degrees or so in the Roman baths and then out into the river. So the top right of the image is the River Avon. So the hot water just goes and just gets drained out into the river. But it's about 1 million litres a day or so that goes into the river at that point around 35 degrees. So it's a huge amount of energy that just basically just gets dumped in the river. And that hot water has been used in other ways by the Romans and Georgian and other periods, but at the moment that's not really made use of. So a key part of this project that makes it known sort of nationally is the fact that one of the key aspects of the project is that we are using a heat source to basically take the heat energy that's in that Roman drain and then pass it through an underfloor heating system in the Abbey as we're renovating the floor. The plan being that the Abbey will be able to have free and obviously sustainable carbon-free heating for decades to come. But the project is much more than that. So I'm going to just talk through the project in kind of 3 key aspects. So on the left, I'll be talking through a little bit on the actual floor renovations themselves. There's also a series of existing vaults that the Abbey own actually below the street level, and we're renovating and opening those up as well as extending them. And then finally, there's a set of Georgian buildings opposite the Abbey that they own that we're turning into their song school facilities and offices. So those are the same 3 areas, but just in a diagram here. So I'll talk through first the floor works on the left there. Then you see down at the bottom of the image, we have the vaults. And those vaults at the moment don't connect either to the Georgian Terraces that you see on the right or to the Abbey. So a key part of the project is connectivity, so linking in basically the Abbey to the buildings that they own opposite through these series of extended vaults that are part of the project. And then, finally, there's on the right-hand side, there's these 5 Georgian Terraces that were just in a really poor state. They've been owned by the Abbey and used as their offices for quite a while, but the 5 terraces have basically been knocked together and through various different periods, and there's no kind of cohesiveness to the way that you were able to travel through those buildings, and they weren't really fit for purpose. So a key part has been upgrading those. So first of all, the floor is actually renovating, doing some serious works to the floor. This isn't the first time it's happened in the Abbey's history. So this is a plan from 150 years ago when the Victorians, led by Gilbert Scott, basically did something very similar to what we're doing. So they dug up the whole floor and laid a limecrete slab, relaid the ledge stones that are those kind of boxes with numbers that you can see on there, and then also incorporated trench heating. So that's what you can see in the dark on the black sort of lines crisscrossing through the floor. And the floor of the Abbey is quite unique. So there's about 2,500 floor stones there, about 1,000 of which are actually inscribed ledger stones. So the Abbey has the densest amount of inscribed ledger stones of any church in the country. So it makes it quite unique, and it's a broad spectrum of the city. So whilst kind of similar status churches like cathedrals would probably have engravings for sort of the rich and famous, because the Abbey is a parish church, and there's sort of 1,000 people that are inscribed in the floor, but then there's a whole more that also have wall memorials. They pretty much represent, a broad brush of the section of the Georgian society. So it's a real kind of key storytelling part of the city of who has formed the city of Bath. But out of those 1,000 people that are inscribed, there's a whole load more that are buried underneath the floor that aren't commemorated in ledger stones or wall memorials. So they're not entirely sure how many, but somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 people are buried underneath this floor. Now, when the Abbey's full, I think it can take just over 1,000 people. So to have about 7,000 to 8,000 people buried underneath is a huge amount of bodies, and obviously they've been decomposing over time and created voids underneath the floor. And you don't need to be a civil engineer to know that that's not a particularly good social structure to have for a floor. So what's happened is that over time the floor's been collapsing in on itself. So the limecrete slab has collapsed, and there's been subsidence up to about 100 mil in certain locations, and that has then also caused the floor stones, the ledge stones themselves, to start cracking and breaking up. So the Abbey have had this issue that they've they had to deal with to stop the subsidence of the floor and to protect the ledger stones that are a key and very important historical asset of high significance. And so this here is a photogrammetric scan of the ledger stones. At this point, about half the pews had been removed, so you can see some areas are still covered in white. That's where the pews were still at the location of this scan being done. But as you can imagine, with something so significant, there's had to be a huge amount of detailed survey work for the recording, and also the in order to then take the project forward in terms of how to rearrange these floor stones. It's been scanned to a high level of detail. So this is just a zoom into one area of that photo, and you can see that there's quite a mixed bag of how these stones have been treated over time. So there's been lots of repairs, some of them quite bodged. A lot of the ledge stones have sort of cracked and broken over time as the floors subsided, and there's been various alterations to the ledge stones. So quite a few of them in quite poor condition, whereas others in much better condition. So there's been a whole kind of series of assessing the survey of the floor stones and working out, okay, which of these stones are in good condition, they can basically just be lifted and then put back down, which of them need a serious amount of restoration work, and which ones are beyond repair. So that's been a big part of our work over the last 3 years, is working with the conservators on the project and sort of assessing sort of stone by stone the condition and the significance to inform how we then relay the floor. A huge amount of research went into this even before we started lifting any stones in terms of like what were the appropriate repair techniques and how effective it would be. So these are just a few examples here of, for example, using stainless steel pins on the back of stones that have been cracked. So assessing how effective those types of repairs would be to effectively consolidating stones that are broken apart and making sure that in the future they would remain as one stone. There's a lot of marbles as well in the bottom left. You can see there's lots of these marbles that might only be 20-30 mil thick. They also through the subsidence had just cracked and fractured, and we needed to find ways through using using matting on the back of them and other techniques to as well ensure that they would not suffer from any further damage. This is the view in the Abbey as it was. So as I said earlier, like a lot of these floor stones were covered by the pews that you can see in this image here. And people have strong feelings about pews in abbeys. Actually, in a church like this, the pews are quite a modern addition. They're Victorian. The Abbey would have been an open space for hundreds of years before the pews were put in. And in many ways, the pews restricted the way that the church could function. It pretty much only allows relatively uncomfortable seating facing one direction. It doesn't allow much flexibility of use. And the Abbey were really keen, with the amount of visitors they get, to be able to use the space in flexible ways and to ensure that it accommodated people with all, with all sort of being able to allow access for disabled users. That at the moment sort of pews didn't really function well with. So part of the project has been the removal of these pews that reveal all of these incredibly beautiful and historically significant floor stones below, but also allow flexibility of use. So this is just a visual of how it can be used in seating arrangement. Obviously, this is a linear seating arrangement, but it can be used flexibly in different modes depending on what kind of events are going on in the Abbey. And also it could just be opened up for when visitors are coming around and able to see all these floor stones and the significance of them as part of the Abbey tours. These are just two sections existing and proposed of, on the left, that's the work that the Victorians did. So there's a 300mm limecrete sort of slab that they put in, and that's the one that was collapsing because underneath that, although they'd compacted the ground, as the bodies decayed and the voids formed underneath the slab, that slab basically just started cracking and falling and causing damage to the ledges above it. And then on the right, you can see what our new floor construction is. So there is a concrete slab with stainless steel reinforcement, and that kind of just effectively floats over the compacted ground below. And if further voids do form in the future, it's been designed with a strength that will allow it to make sure it can span over those voids and provides a stable base for what you can see above the slab, which is the screed layer with the underfloor heating system that we're putting in from using the heat from the thermal springs. And then above that, the relaying of the ledge stones and bedding. And all of this work that we're doing is within a metre depth. So the Victorians, when they did their works, they worked within that metre and weren't particularly necessarily careful of the fact that this was a consecrated burial ground. So they pretty much just churned up all of the burials that were in there and then just compacted it down and put their new floor on. So that's disturbed ground within that metre. So we have tried to work just within that metre depth to allow the undisturbed burials below not being affected by the works. This is just one of the scans that the surveyors have done during the project of once we've dug down that metre. This is in the east end, and there are some areas where some of the intact burials, so there's a lead coffins that you can kind of see in the centre of that image that are poking out. So there's certain areas where we then had to work around the fact that there were burials maybe higher than we were expecting, but generally everything within that metre has allowed us to do the floor construction that I just showed you. And what you can see here as well, you can see where the columns are. They are sitting on some large footings, and this was an expected part of the project, but it really helped inform the history of the site. So this diagram here helps explain some of what we've just seen in that last image. So in the black outline, the thick black outline, you can see the current footprint of the Abbey, which is 500 years old, but it sits on the same foundation of what you can see in orange here is a Norman cathedral, which was much larger than the existing Abbey, but the current sort of columns of the Abbey largely lie on top of those Norman cathedral foundations. And what that has meant is that we've, in particular areas, excavated a little bit lower where we've been able to, and come across things that we didn't expect to find, or not least in the kind of condition that we found them. So this is an area we've gone down to about 2-meter depth, and we've actually come across the old floor of the Norman Cathedral. So this is a floor that hadn't been seen for pretty much 800 years since it had been covered over, and they're these beautiful clay tiles. Would have been fully sort of black and white before the some of the glazing has come off, but still in incredibly good condition, where you can see in that image on the left, even like the west front of the Abbey has been engraved on one of the tiles, and you can see the different engravings of the period that are put on there. So a huge amount of kind of a huge amount of research has been done in terms of the history of the site through the project. And there is a whole load of archaeological interest on this project that would probably be a separate talk, so I'm not going to go into any further detail on it. But I would recommend, if you're interested, Wessex Archaeology, who have been the archaeologists on the project, they've been great at recording this, and if you go either on their blog or on their Twitter feed, or also if you go on Sketchfab, they have various 3D models of their scans that they've published. If you just look up Wessex Archaeology on the Sketchfab website, you can sort of look around the 3D scans of loads of items. So there we've got some Roman tiles and various finds that they found within the build-up of the Abbey floor. So I recommend looking at that if you're interested. But I want to talk a little bit more just about our role, which has been kind of putting together this crazy jigsaw puzzle, where we've been trying to retain as much of the existing floor as we've been able to, but because we've been realigning the trench heating and allowing for new boundaries around the columns for electrical containment, it doesn't mean that we've just been able to pretty much just put the floor stones back where they were and just fill in between. Actually, it's been a very complicated jigsaw puzzle to work out where they can all go in a kind of coherent order. This is going back to the scan of the completed floor previously. So this is what it was like before, and then this is the completed floor plan of that jigsaw puzzle that I just mentioned. And one of the things I forgot to mention is one of the key aspects of this project was not just to put in this underfloor heating system into the whole floor of the Abbey as its only heat source, but to use trench heating to counteract some of the issues with downdraft that were kind of a result of the original design that the Victorians had. So as you can see, in the centre of the nave, they had trench heating put in the centre, whereas we've relocated these to the edges so that they sit underneath the main nave windows. So if I go to this, this is some analysis done before during the technical design, where the trench heating at the moment that was in the centre that the Victorians had basically meant that hot air rose up to the top, and then when it got to the large Gothic windows, it would just cool down and basically create these big downdrafts of cold air to anyone who was sitting on the end of the pew. So we've kind of done sort of thermal analysis to work out where the best locations for these trench heaters to counteract downdrafts, and then the underfloor heating then provides like this consistent low-level heat that provides a comfort for people at ground level. So it's all been kind of carefully considered how to realign the kind of floor layout with the heating system that's gone in. I'm just going to show you some images. This is the east end that was completed back in I think either 2018, 2019 now. These are some professional photos. We're still waiting for professional photos for the rest of the Abbey. This is one that the Abbey themselves took just last week. We're hoping to get the professional photos through soon as well, but this just shows you the kind of completed floor. So the floor relay works are pretty much complete now. It's the works outside the Abbey that still have a few months to go. But as you can see here, this is where the trench heating is now being relocated to the sides to counteract those downdrafts. And in many ways, the floor kind of looks like maybe nothing has actually been done to it. That's probably the best compliment we've received from people as they've gone in, that it doesn't actually look like we've done any work. But at least we've made sure all of these incredibly important stones have been repaired sensitively, and that the flooring that is now beneath them is stable and will mean that it is able to be preserved for generations to come. And that's just a shot of the new lighting that's gone in as well. I wanted to talk through the vaults as well. So the existing vaults that the Abbey have, they're directly underneath the public street above. But as I said earlier, they don't connect either to the Abbey or to the Georgian Terraces opposite on the right there. So one of the key aspects has been how can we renovate and extend those vaults in order to create connectivity. So you can see there's the Abbey on the top of the page there, and then in the kind of light brown colour in the L shape, these are the Georgian Terraces that we are renovating for. There's choir practice spaces, there's offices on the upper levels, and then down in the bottom sort of middle section here, there's a kind of kitchen facilities and toilets and an archive space. So we've basically used the vaults, which is what everything that you kind of see here in the yellow colour, to basically provide a connection between the Abbey and these Georgian terraces. And the kind of one of the key parts of that is in the southwest corner of the Abbey, where we've actually gone down a level. So if I just go to an elevation, a picture of the Abbey here, on the bottom level of the Abbey here in the southwest corner, this is actually a 1920s extension, a single-story 1920s extension to the Abbey, which they've used as their kind of shop facility and exit of the Abbey. But it's only a single story at ground floor and doesn't connect to the vaults below. So what we have done is we've excavated down in this location. This is, well, the bit on the left is kind of part way through the excavation, the one on the right a bit further down. Actually, what you can see here in the right hand image is, I don't know if you can quite spot, there's a fireplace there with some walls. So this was a building at some point where someone built their house up against the Abbey walls, and that was their fireplace next to the buttresses of the Abbey. So we've gone down a full story here, all kind of having to deal with the sensitive archaeology, but we've kind of exposed the buttresses there that you can see on the right of the south wall of the Abbey, and that excavation has now been complete, and we're putting in a new floor. So we have a ground floor and a basement floor. So this is an image done at design stage, and you can see what we've incorporated is this staircase that will now connect from the ground floor of the Abbey down into the new, the basement level here is called the Discovery Centre, which is where they'll exhibit a lot of the architectural finds of the project, and then through there we'll connect into the vaults. And then we've also incorporated this skylight into the existing roof to kind of bring light down into that vault space, but also kind of provide views up into up to the Abbey itself. And in many ways, like a large percentage of this project has been kind of conservation of the floor, or dealing with historic current historic fabric. But where we have been able to make interventions, we've tried to really make the most of those. So this kind of staircase has been one that we've kind of put a huge amount of effort and focus on, trying to incorporate a contemporary staircase with kind of a crafted metalwork. And at this stage, it was a precast concrete staircase. It's now changed to in situ. I'll show you those photos in a moment. But yeah, trying to kind of incorporate the contemporary additions into the historic fabric here. So this is what we did at design stage of how the new kind of staircase would link with the masonry of the Abbey. This is a visual again showing that we kind of wanted this kind of sleek curved concrete staircase that didn't really touch the walls or the floor, so it just touches. We kind of had to do quite a lot of detailed design work with the engineers on this one, so that it's kind of it has a kind of contact point at the base, at the basement level, and at the ground above, that kind of doesn't touch the walls of the Abbey. And then this is what it's like on site at the moment, or at least it was a few weeks ago. So still a way to go. There's still a certain amount of the treatment of the concrete and the floor to go in. And this space, well, at ground level, will still be the kind of the shop and sort of access for the Abbey. But at basement level, as I said, this is going to be the place where they'll exhibit all of their sort of archaeological finds and sort of tell the story of the history of the Abbey and the site. This is in the vaults themselves, so this is just a bit further south, so we're kind of between the Abbey and the Georgian Terraces here, and we've got the street above us in this image. So the existing vaults are listed, and they are owned by the Abbey and used for storage, but currently they, well, as in not currently, but before the work started, this is pretty much what they look like. They were incredibly damp because of the water from the street above just filtering through. They'd kind of tried various impervious coatings to try and improve the dampness in space, but there wasn't really any way of doing that. And they're all very kind of small cellular spaces and couldn't be really adequately used for anything. So one of the key things that we've done is incorporate a new waterproof slab above these to allow, and also remove the coatings to allow the masonry to breathe. Also, a key part of the project here has been opening up these small cellular spaces into, I'll go back to this image, into far more open and usable spaces. So what you can see in the sort of center of the image here is that we've incorporated these exposed concrete frames to support the existing masonry vaults. So this is just a diagram of those concrete, one of those concrete frames. And so we couldn't take these vaults down and reconstruct them. We had to have an elaborate set of temporary works to support them, and then cast these concrete frames in place. And again, generally we are conserving the historic fabric, but where we are making interventions, whether that was the stair that I just showed you before, or these frames, we are kind of going for a high grade kind of exposed concrete finish to kind of show where we've made interventions in the space. This is what it looked like a few weeks ago. Still quite a lot of kind of finishing work going on in the space. But as you can see, we're kind of opening these vaults up, and you can sort of see in the sort of far point of the picture there, you can see the light. That's natural light that's coming through. So what we've also done is we've brought the vaults away from the wall of the Abbey and incorporated skylights. There'll be one on the right-hand side of this image as well, to just allow natural light to come into these basement spaces as well. So the idea is that now these vaults will be first of all dry and also have natural light in them, and then through the kind of interventions that we made, they become quite generous, but also interesting spaces as you kind of journey through between the Abbey and these Georgian terraces. You really get a sense of where it sits between these two buildings. And then finally, I just wanted to talk briefly about the Georgian terraces as well. So there's 5 Georgian terraces that, as I said, weren't really fit for purpose. The Abbey had been using them in previous years as their offices, but weren't really adequate spaces to work in, and again, suffering from a huge amount of damp at the lower levels. I won't talk through all of the work that we've done on those, but I will talk about one space in particular. So at the moment, the choir for the Abbey would practice in that 1920s extension that I showed you before, but in a very small confined space. So one of the key parts of the project for the Georgian Terraces was incorporating facilities for the Abbey choir, and also any other visiting groups that might perform at the Abbey to use as practice facilities. So we've done some pretty substantial structural works in order to open up 2 floors and 2 two of the terraces together into this choir practice room. So what you can see here, this is effectively the basement and the ground floor level knocked through of two separate terraces. So this was previously an account eight. Yeah, it was 8 rooms previously, and then we've taken out party wall and floor to open it up. And there's a whole load of kind of acoustic design that's gone into this to make it a space that's kind of fit for the Abbey choir and others that may be visiting. So this is what it looked like, I think maybe a couple of years ago now. So you can see some of the steelwork going in there for the kind of like the gantry level, but there's steelwork above as well to hold up the party wall and to open up the space. And whilst it's quite sort of substantial work structurally to do this, we've then tried to obviously retain as much of the Georgian character of the sash windows, even though we had to incorporate things like secondary glazing due to the acoustics, but we've tried to sort of still incorporate those features as much as possible into the space. This is what it looked like, I think this was a couple of weeks ago, so there's still various bits of joinery, sort of furniture that need to go on that lower level. You can see still haven't gone in. But yeah, most of it is now in there, and it's going to be a world apart from what the Abbey had before as their practice facilities. And it's also a space that then is directly connected into the Abbey, so you can walk through from here through the vaults and then directly into the Abbey, whereas before they were in a separate building and required people to walk across the street in order to get to a performance after they practiced. That's probably all I want to say. It's a whistle stop tour on a very big and complicated project, so I know I've probably skipped over huge bits, but hopefully it's just of interest for any of you who maybe do want to work on historic buildings or just the reuse of existing buildings. I know with the whole retrofit first campaign at the moment, and looking for how can we make the most of our existing stock of buildings. I think this project, obviously not everyone has the luxury of a nearby local hot water system that you can tap into for the underfloor heating system, but still I think one of the things that I've really valued and learned through this project is that just some key moves to do with connecting existing spaces and making those interventions work really hard means that the parts of the scheme that the Abbey already did have now are just working so much better for them, and will mean that these facilities will be so much more usable and also so much more user-friendly. They can now invite people with fully disabled access the whole way through the scheme. They can invite schools in, they can invite all types of groups to use the facilities, use the building in a way that was nowhere near possible before. So in terms of securing the church for the congregation, but also for its importance for use by the city, hopefully this has kind of secured its usability for the 21st century and beyond. So that's probably where I'll stop, but I don't know if people have been posting questions as we've been going, Mimi, but happy to answer any of those.
Big round of applause. Thanks so much, Andy, for your presentation. A little bit, yeah, it was short but very comprehensive with the amount of information that you're offering. So please, can people start writing their questions on the chat? That would be great. Simon Chadwick has just asked if Fergus was involved in this project.
Yes, so I started working with Fergus when I first started on this project 4 years ago. I think I worked with him for about a year and a half or so. So he'd taken it through pretty much from 10 years ago when it kind of started up. He'd done a huge amount of the groundwork and then the permissions that were required for this. So it really was a long build up trying to secure the funding and the permissions for this project, and Fergus did all of that. So he hasn't seen it through the construction phase. So he started up his own practice, but yeah, he was heavily involved, and a lot of his work's gone into this.
I might kick start off with a question. There's so much history, as you've started to mention already, and there's like layering approach of different ages, etc. And I think in terms of lots of students, and when we start looking at projects, we might try and think of everything as important, but obviously there's some slice of history that you've had to deem as less significant. And is there a certain amount of methodology behind that, and where have those choices come about, and why did you end up with those outcomes?
Yeah, it's all about kind of that balance of like the significance of the fabric, but then balancing that with the user requirements. And one of the things that I sort of believe really strongly in terms of all the whole retrofit aspect, and especially with church buildings that can often come under very sort of strict regulation in terms of what they can do with their buildings, is that one of the best things for a building, a historic building, is for it to be used and have a congregation, especially in church context, for it to have a congregation that is thriving. Because if there's a thriving congregation or a thriving user, that building is sustainable in the sense that it'll have people that can invest in that building and make sure that it's kept well. One of the problems with so many of the church buildings in this country is that because they don't have thriving congregations, and maybe they haven't been able to do the changes required to make it usable, it means that people are no longer able to use the space. And then as soon as you have an empty building, or a building that doesn't really have the user that has the resources to keep it up, then that causes long-term damage to the building. So with this project, there had to be a huge amount of research that went in, before. A huge amount of research had to go in into what are the most significant parts of this project that we want to retain, but which ones are going to have to give. So I think probably the pews are the best example of this. So in this image, you can see in the sort of the distance of the end of the Abbey nave there, you can see that there's some pews that have gone back. So people felt differently about the pews. Some people said that they should remain, that the pews, the Victorian pews, were key to the character of the building, but they were not only covering a lot of the floor stones, but they were also meaning that the Abbey couldn't have a range of functions. They couldn't have the flexibility of space to use the building how they wanted to. And it's not how the building was originally built. They're not inherent to the building. But there was kind of like a look at the significance in this balancing act, where the pews that you can see there at the east end, they were probably of the finest quality as the corporation stalls. So they have been retained. So there's still that aspect of the work that Gilbert Scott did in the Abbey. That's the highest sort of quality of craftsmanship, and that's been retained. But everything that's kind of west of that, so from the crossing of the Abbey westwards, the pews have been removed, and then there's the flexibility. So it's kind of, it's not a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. Like, it is always looking at, okay, well, what are the most significant parts that we do retain, and where do other elements that might have significance, but those don't outweigh the needs of the project or the needs of the user.
Great. Well answered, thank you. We've got a question from Russell. He's asking, what time frame are these alterations intended to secure the future of the Abbey for? So how did this influence the materials and technologies used?
Yeah, so the Abbey floor itself is probably the easiest to answer in the sense that this has been a huge project for the Abbey to undertake, 10 years just to get it done. A huge amount of money has gone into that, and just the amount of repair work. This isn't something that can be done regularly. So this was seen as being something that should last various generations, like over 100 years for the floor. So and it's sort of a balancing act where the concrete slab that we put in has sort of stainless steel reinforcement, and there's a whole kind of discussion around like how much stainless steel should go in. Obviously, from the environmental perspective, you don't want to put loads in, but at the same time, this is a building that's been around 500 years already. It wants to be around for hundreds more, and the problem with the work that the Victorians did was that they did that 150 years ago, but within tens of years it was already starting to subside in locations, and that was then causing damage to the floor stones. So the amount of effort that goes into changing something like this means that you're not talking about the time frame of 20, 50, 75 years. You want them to look at sort of 3 figures up. So there you then take a much sort of longer term view. Whereas, for example, then in the Georgian Terraces on the right, like we've taken I guess a lighter approach, where we've still gone for sort of robust materials, but there is an element that, you know, as a set of Georgian Terraces separate from the building, you know, it could definitely change use and ownership in the years. So we've allowed for more flexibility in that, also in terms of the material choice. And so yeah, no, I don't know if that answers the question, but hopefully that's a couple of examples on it.
I think it does. We have one more question by Hassan. He says, just want to say that's really informative. It's interesting how works in historic buildings differ from usual sites and come with their own challenges. So thanks a lot for presenting this. He then goes on to say, were there any challenges related to surveying the site, and how did you go about producing accurate plans and drawings?
Yeah, so there certainly isn't something that we could have done as sort of architects and gone in and surveyed ourselves. So I would say in some ways, this is, well, from my experience of working on it for 4 years, it's kind of the building you just keep going back to again and again and again to survey details in terms of sketch forms. Actually, one of the things that I've loved on the project is that I've constantly had to go back, and every part of the building is unique, and you know, it's not like you can produce a set standard of details that works everywhere. So there's been a kind of ongoing qualitative survey work by me and colleagues for, you know, individual aspects as we developed design detail. But in terms of the initial survey work, like I showed that scan right at the beginning, if I flick through all the way back. Yeah, this one here. So this would actually, so it's a photo survey taken from a meter above the location. This is a huge file, but this was done by a surveying company that gave us both the photo survey that is to scale, but then they also then drew around every single individual stone, and each individual stone was given a number. So there's a huge amount of professional work that went into that by surveyors to, you know, record the floor in detail, not just to inform obviously our new floor layout, but also just as a record in time of what the Victorian floor works were. And then yeah, similarly with just the general sort of survey of the building. I think because of when it was done, a lot of the surveys that we were using, the sort of 2D surveys from 5, 6, 7 years ago. I think if this was being redone now, it'd be interesting to see how much sort of 3D scanning would be used in a project like this. I think that probably would have been a really useful tool that we, just because of the time that we were working on it, the design phase didn't quite make use of, but a lot of the projects that we're now doing at FCB are kind of using the photogrammetric surveys, so you have all that sort of 3D information and photos to go back to, which are incredibly valuable when it comes to making ongoing decisions.
I think, Annie, we'll come back to you in a second, but Kath has got a similar question. I don't know if she'd like to elaborate on it more, but she's saying the drawing on the slide looks like it's from a digital model. So how was the model made? I think it's being referred to
this one.
Yeah, that one, I believe. I don't know if you'd like to unmic and add anything else, but yes. Is it from a digital model? And how?
Yeah, so you're not going to believe this. This is actually Fergus, who was mentioned in the first question. This is probably one of his lasting legacies. He's actually built the Abbey model itself in SketchUp. So we haven't used the SketchUp model for sort of much technical work. That's where we've used all the professional 2D surveys. But Fergus spent a huge amount of time modelling that all in SketchUp that we have used. We've actually since had our BIM sort of coordinator in the office has actually built the Abbey as well in Revit. That was actually for a master's project that he was doing. Again, I think if we were doing this project now, we'd probably have a more accurate way of 3D modelling it. This was actually done in SketchUp, and this is just a render I did I want to say Enscape, I think, and then a bit of Photoshop on top. But
we have a wow in the comments box. Be interested in the model. Great. Annie, would you like to unmic and ask your question?
Hiya, that was a really interesting talk. I was wondering, for the vaults room, there was some sort of like white paint coat over it. I was wondering what that is, and like, does it provide any type of like fire resistance or something? I think.
Yeah, I'll just get this here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the moment, as you can see, if we go back here, at the moment it doesn't have that white colour that's in the visual here, and actually it won't look like that. So what is currently in the proposal is that these are going to be whitewashed and receive a breathable coating. So what was on here before, what you can see kind of peeling off the existing vaults, were, because they had such issues with damp and wet coming through, they basically coated it with impervious paintings. But the problem with that is that the masonry behind us stays wet and doesn't have the opportunity to dry, which is damaging to the stone. So what we've done is we've basically removed all of those impervious coatings to allow the masonry to breathe and dry out. But because we've got a concrete slab that has got waterproofing on top, it means that the water that was coming from street level above won't be going through. So over time it'll dry out. Now, at the moment, the masonry isn't fully dried out, so we can't put any paint coatings on that. So it looks a little bit gnarly, but you kind of have to let the masonry breathe out fully before you put anything on it. And so whilst we are putting a breathable coating back on, that'll have a white tint to it, we're leaving it exposed at the moment to dry out as quickly as possible before putting that on. But the concrete will remain a similar colour that it is now. I think that's just a visual thing.
Okay, that's quite interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's not to do with fire. It's just to do with moisture.
Okay, thanks.
And would there be no option to leave it exposed and, I don't know, offer more ventilation or something? You can say if that's a stupid suggestion, Andy.
I know so actually the reason for giving it a coating is more actually to do with because it's suffered a lot from water damage in the past. There's quite like a powdery surface to it, so it's almost just to fix the surface of the stone, just so that it's basically doesn't cause a maintenance issue where it's constantly getting like a really dusty surface that then can fall off. So cosmetically, like it'll be similar to what it is currently there, and we're not necessarily trying to go for kind of a super slick finish to this. Like, it is an underground space, like it is an underground found space, and you've got the kind of the buttresses that you can see there on the walls, and there's bits where, because this was used as a by the Pickman Press, which is a famous printmakers in Bath, and they did a whole load of alterations. So there's lots of kind of bits where the masonry's been penetrated through at different periods, so that there's these kind of signs of character in the masonry vaults that we're happy to live with. So we kind of got kind of fine finish of the concrete in the new interventions that we've put, but we're accepting that these are underground vaults and they have a character in themselves, and we're not necessarily trying to completely wash over that. So the kind of the grain and the texture of it is part of the
there has been quite a lot of work on, for example, the heating strategy, and also allowing the moisture now to breathe from the vaults. Do you have a particular ventilation strategy? Because I'm not particularly seeing like any pipes or anything visible. So I don't know, does that mean there isn't any, or are they just being concealed in a...
Yeah, so I don't have any, unfortunately I don't have any drawings of this, but what we have is in the roof of the Jackson extension, on the southwest of the Abbey, where we have the ground story, we have a whole series of air intake penthouses that basically draw air right down into the vaults, and then air is mechanically drawn through this series of vaults and then pulled through into the Georgian Terraces. And we've actually reused all of the or most of the actual flues in the chimneys in the Kingston building, so it's the 5 terraces here, we've actually then used the chimney flues to be then drawing the air out, so all the fresh air kind of gets drawn in through the Discovery Centre in the Jackson Extension here in the north west, and then gets pulled through the vault and then up through the buildings. At the upper stories of the Georgian Terraces, it's just natural ventilation because we've got sash windows and it's not a particularly deep plan, so that's easy to deal with. But the vaults themselves have air drawn through in that arrangement.
We have a question from John saying, "Hi Andy, fantastic talk. Looks like a brilliant project to work on. Obviously you're using some modern techniques to help future-proof the building, but is there elements to learn from historical building techniques that we could use again today? For example, you mentioned limecrete."
I think it's interesting, like one of the things that we've had to deal with on the project is inappropriate repairs. So whether those are, well, like in the vaults where there's the coatings that have been done, which, a lot of these kind of products were sold as, miracle products that would stop your water coming through your historic wall or whatever. Like, actually a lot of cementitious coatings or contemporary things are damaging to buildings like this, and using the traditional methods is generally the way to go. So for example, on the, again, I don't have a photo of it in the presentation, but the Georgian Terraces, the whole south wall of that had been covered in cementitious coatings that we've actually removed because they were causing slowly the wall, which was only about 160 mil of ashlar, the outer surface was starting to disintegrate. So we've had to do work to counteract the contemporary work that's damaging the historic fabric. So yeah, generally we've used traditional methods, but that doesn't mean that we haven't gone for contemporary solutions, like for example the concrete slab with the stainless steel. Like, that's because you couldn't really there are a whole range of different options that were explored for the floor, but that was the only kind of viable solution to provide a long-term structural support there. So I'm not sure if that answers the question quite right, but yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that generally traditional is the way that we've gone, except for where contemporary solution is providing something that the traditional couldn't.
John, do you have anything else you'd like to add to your question? I think you've answered it well.
No, sorry, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We got a question from Max saying, "Thanks for the interesting talk. Can you talk a bit more about your particular role and what the team for the project looked like? So is there a connection? Oh, and also, is there a connection at basement level with the Roman baths?"
Yes. So my particular role, so I joined sort of technical design stage, and at that point, project team was Fergus, that I just mentioned before, who sort of carried it through from the initial stages, myself, and then the project architect Alex, and then since the kind of construction phase, it's mainly been Alex and myself full time. So Alex is project architect, and then I actually use this as my part 3 case study, and sort of taken more responsibility on the project as we've gone. So my main role was the actual floor of the Abbey, doing the crazy jigsaw puzzle and trying to get my head around where they could all go. Yeah, in some ways I was maybe fresh out of uni and hadn't worked on loads of historic projects before. But the good thing about the kind of the floor works and the giant puzzle is that's not something that not many people have experience in that, and a set of fresh eyes was helpful in some ways on that. But we have both Alex and James Simpson, who's another colleague who's been working on the construction phase, incredibly sort of knowledgeable in the conservation side of projects and worked on many conservation projects before. So yeah, I've been sort of learning from them on that.
And the second question was, is there a connection at basement level with the Roman baths?
Oh yeah, sorry. So no, they're not. They are separate entities. There is a connection just to do with an escape access, but there isn't. There's no sort of, you can't, the public from one can't move to the other. They are separate spaces. So they are only sort of divided by the walls of the. Sorry, I'm not explaining myself well, but the Roman baths extend underground as well. So whilst there's the actual building that you see at ground floor, they also have a series of vaults that extend out, and they meet the vaults of the Abbey, but they aren't. They don't connect through.
And we have a question from Tara. Thanks for the great talk. When the team removed the 1 metre of existing Abbey floor, how did their anticipated archaeological findings compare with actual findings? And how did you mitigate against this risk to the construction programme?
Well, there was quite a large contingency on the project for the archaeological work. So there had been quite substantial tests done before, to inform the project. Various test pits had been done to basically try and calculate where the best locations were, for example, for the new trenches that we were putting in, and the depths of the dig. So they had a pretty good idea of that metre was ground that had been churned up previously, and that we weren't going to be dealing with too much undisturbed burials. But it was a project where basically every stage where we were digging through these sort of sensitive areas, both in the vaults and in the Abbey, the archaeologists were on site and had to do a lot of that digging, and either supervise with the main contractor doing the digging, or take, certain aspects of the project were dug out completely by the archaeologists. Actually, in the vaults area just down sort of the middle of this picture where the Jackson extension is, there are a whole series of Saxon burials in there. So I think they're about 1,000-year-old charcoal burials. And yeah, aspects of that do stop the project, and there have been delays to the project, but the project has always been, it always had a long time frame, and it was always a project that needed to be done right, and also seemed to be done right. Obviously, loads of people were really interested in this project and the historical significance of it. So it's been really well researched before the project started, and then really well documented as it's gone through, and where the Abbey have had to allow extra time because of unforeseen archaeological aspects of it, and then that's been taken. But that also kind of, like, obviously on a lot of construction projects, archaeological things cause a bit of headaches in terms of the delay, but the good thing about all the kind of archaeological stuff that we've come across with this project, especially informing the story that the Abbey can then tell in their display centre that they're going to open up to the public. So in some ways, the more that they found, the more that they then have to display and tell. So there's a whole, the Abbey floor itself, as well as having the burials in it, there are a whole load of medieval plasterwork and marbles, and like loads of parts that are basically just being thrown in the ground when they'd put in the floor originally. But yeah, there's all loads of useful, interesting archaeological finds. And as I say, if you go on the Wessex Archaeology website, they've documented that really well, and the Sketchfab website allows you to kind of look at the 3D scans of it. So that's worth looking at.
Thank you, Tara says. As I look at this photo, you can see that there's the kind of gap between the side of the Abbey and the townhouse. And you're going to have to correct me / elaborate on this, but when you're mentioning about how that house was built up right next to the Abbey, was it right at one point the Abbey was literally built up to all around? And I think that's just so fascinating, because we often view abbeys and cathedrals as these standalone pride objects, sort of surrounded by green, but the Bath Abbey is quite different to that. Like, there is quite a lot of building around it, and I don't know, is that true about it being built up to, and is there a bit more history that you can maybe talk about in that aspect?
Yeah, I'll get the image up. So it's interesting, different how views change over time. Like, obviously now any kind of work to such an important building like Bath Abbey, there's a huge amount of work that has to go in and permissions and all that kind of stuff, whereas other periods of history haven't necessarily had the same respect for building. The Abbey itself was actually in disrepair for quite a long time and didn't even have a roof at one point. Can't quite remember the period that the roof was missing, but depending on the political and religious context at the time, churches either had more or less resources and were either more or less protected and taken care of. And the Abbey was historically a much more community used space. So it actually had, what you can see here is these houses that were built up against the Abbey walls. It had houses built up on both sides, and even now, if you look carefully at the Abbey, you can see marks where the roofs of the terraces met the Abbey walls. I think from memory, the building you see here, I think was a 3-story or 4-story, and there are historical drawings where you can see the building sort of built up against it, because obviously space was tight in the medieval city, and yeah, there wasn't the same, I guess, restrictions on what you could or couldn't do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely mad. Like, can you imagine a 3 or 4 story townhouse like abutting the stained glass window? I think it's crazy.
And in this example, like they obviously built the 3 walls of their lounge here, and you still got the lime plaster and the fireplace intact there, and then they plastered over the buttress, and the Abbey wall was their kind of 4th wall of their lounge. I guess they snuggled up there in the evening with the Abbey wallers.
Something again that someone mentioned earlier, I think it was about the challenges related to surveying the site, and again, when I visited the Abbey, just seeing the amount of precision that goes in and the amount of time that is taken to, for example, extract the stones, the floor stones, take it up, put it together, lay it out. I don't know if you want to add any more a bit about that process or quite how laborious it is.
Yeah, I think because I guess people might understand surveying being purely about we need to know what's there in order to work out what we can do and propose around it. I think on a project like this, again, it comes back to the significance thing we mentioned earlier. Like, the archaeologists are there to document both the things that are there and need to be retained, and we have had areas where we've had to change the design around the archaeological findings. So actually in the vaults in the space where I showed you where that concrete vault was going, we've had to divert a trench around what they believe is part of the Saxon church. We found part of that as part of the architectural dig. So we've had to work around the archaeological finds, but also obviously there's quite a lot of things that get documented that are of enough significance to very clearly document, but aren't going to be kept. So for example, what you can see here with the buildings up against the Abbey, they are Georgian buildings. They're not necessarily, whilst there is still a significance there, they're not as unique as, for example, the Saxon finds that were in the vault space. So what's really important is that it's documented so that information is there, and they would have done 3D scans at different stages of the dig, so you kind of almost get these kind of layers that you then have a historical record of. So that information isn't lost, but in some areas the fabric has been taken away. Again, it just comes back to that significance of it, but yeah, the importance of documenting the story for its own sake, not just for the architectural decision making, is important.
Following on from that question, says Max, what happened to the Norman tiles within the Abbey? Were they left exposed or lifted and moved into the vaults, or recorded and covered over? Or
yeah, so these ones here. So it again was like one of those moments where it's you have to sort of make a decision around, do you change the design around it? Do you make something of it or not? The issue with this is that although it kind of looks, where we take the photo here, you can see it quite clearly. This is one of the areas where the corporation pews at the east end are going back in, and those pews are actually raised. So this is 2 meters below the floor level. And then once the pews are in, they're 3 and a bit meters, I think, below. So by the time, eye level, it'd be 4 meters below where you'd be standing. So there are other areas in the Abbey where we've incorporated skylight, walk on glass in the floor, so that you can see. We've done that around the Roman footings, the Norman footings, so that you can actually see from that image that I showed before. You can actually see the Norman foundations, and then you can see the Abbey, the current Gothic Abbey columns built on top. So there were areas where we could display what was below, whereas this was a location where really feasibly we couldn't incorporate corporation stores and incorporate this in any way that was visible. So that again, they've done a incredibly detailed scan of this, and it's been meticulously recorded. But whereas maybe some people would say, well, couldn't it be lifted and then be displayed somewhere? Actually, it's important that stays where it is, that's left intact, and that it's protected. It's not going to deteriorate further from being covered. But there wasn't a viable way of having it displayed in any meaningful way, unfortunately. So yeah, unfortunately, they'll have copies of it in the display centre in the vaults when they're open to the public, but there won't be a physical copy won't be there, unfortunately.
I think also something I remember you mentioning is that you've presented it to us and we're probably all quite like-minded in the way that we see conservation. Our opinions might differ, but with reasoning we can understand the motives behind them. Perhaps within the public, the process has not been as easy and things might have been seen as controversial. Has there been any really controversial aspects, particularly from people maybe from the heritage and conservation side of things? And if so, how have you been able to mediate those objections?
Yeah, well, it was, and actually what's unique on church projects like this is that the work that's outside of the church building is subject to planning and listed building consent. So there's a whole area of things there that are involved. The church itself comes under its own ecclesiastical permissions. So effectively you have 2 separate sets of permissions that you need to get, and therefore 2 sets of bodies that are interested. And as well as that, you then have loads of other interested parties. So, for example, the Victorian Society, as well as a large percentage of the public, were up in arms about the pews that you see in the image here being lifted and taken away. And again, it just comes down to perception. Like for them, and for many people in the public, like you'd see pews as being, the traditional right way of a church building. Like, and people feel quite strongly that to remove the pews is to remove an integral part of the character of the building. And there was actually a court case. So the Victorian Society took the Abbey it was within the ecclesiastical system, but basically took them to court, and there was a whole sort of trial hearing, and a lot of time and money and time spent on it, and they did get approval for it. But again, it all comes down to how you view significance in this and the balance of that. So again, the pews here were causing a huge issue with how the space could be used and the disabled access users, and the fact that actually the floor stones are more significant, or could be sort of deemed more significant than the pews, but the pews were both protecting them from view, so you can actually expose this beautiful floor, but potentially also causing more of the damage to them. So there were lots of people both within the permission systems themselves, but also outside of those, that were parties that had to. The Abbey have been very good at making all of this very public, because as you can imagine, there are certain projects that, if they're a private building that's listed, as long as listed building, you get listed building permission, that's one body you need to appease. But this is a building that's visited by 500,000 people a year. Lots of people have views on it, so it all has to be done quite openly. And there were lots of sort of dialogues with the local community and various bodies where they were invited in and talk through the project, talk through, this is why the pews are being removed, these are the reasons, these are the benefits. Yes, we do admit that there's a cost to it as well, but the benefits outweigh them. So that's why the project took so long, because there was lots of those discussions to be had.
Max is apologising for monopolising the questions, but another one for you. What happened to the pews? Were they reused elsewhere? What happened to them?
So the pews were actually sold, I think, on bathabbeypews.com, if I remember right. I can't quite remember, something like that. So yeah, they were actually used to raise money for the project. So they are being reused and relocated, but by sort of private investors that have bought them. But yeah, they're not in the Abbey. So yeah, it's the East End, the higher grade ones that have been retained at the East End, but in the rest of it, it's just an open space now.
If anyone has any final questions, please pipe up now. But if not, and Max again, what floor covering was used where ledges weren't in a suitable condition to reuse?
Yes, so we've primarily used pennant and blue lias. So those are kind of two stone types that have been used where new stone has been put in, and also we've used that where we've had there's been lots of inscribed marbles that are only 20 mil or 30 mil deep, that the backing stones that they were originally inlaid in weren't good enough condition anymore. So we've used pennant and blue lias as well for where we've had to have new backing stones for marbles. And those are both stones that were already in the floor, and were also sort of locally, you could sort of source relatively locally. So yeah, again, matching the characteristics of the existing floor stones was important. So there's a whole broad range of other types of stones that are in the floor, but those two would be kind of a dominant type. So that's what we went for the new ones.
Max has got enough questions to go all night, so I don't know if
Zoom.
Yeah, feel free to unmic if you would like to ask another question.
Hi, hi Andy. Thank you very much for the talk. I found it very interesting, having studied at Bath. I was kind of wondering, because you said that that there were consultants involved who were conservators. So how much input did they have in the project versus, you said that your project architect had a conservation experience. Mm-hmm. Sort of what was Feilden Clegg Bradley's involvement and what was contributed by external parties?
Yeah, so because we have a local contractor, Emery's main contractor for the project, but then they've had various sort of specialists on different areas working. So the floor works and some of the other masonry works outside of the Abbey has been done by Sally Straightu's Historic Conservation, which are quite well known and reputable conservators. And they're, especially on the floor works, myself, James, who's the guy I mentioned earlier with the vast amount of historic experience having worked on Manchester Cathedral previous to this. So him, myself, and Sally Straightu's, the conservators, it was always that basically that the 3 years of the floor works were like an ongoing sort of discussion. So every day lifted the floor stones and did documenting for each of those. So they did a pre-lift assessment of what they thought the condition was before they lifted it. They did they then did another assessment when it was lifted off and in the yard. They then did sort of post the repairs, they also did an assessment of it before it went back in the floor. So they did a lot of documenting of the condition of the floor stones, and effectively we had a system with them where we had an agreement of which stones, they could happily say that doesn't need any further repair work, but there was always like a middle band of stones where they had question marks on them. Again, this whole issue of significance, like a lot of the stones could be repaired, but at what cost and at what point does the amount of repair you're doing to a stone, which might not last actually that long, because some stones you might be able to repair for 10, 20 years, but actually we were wanting to make sure that the stones we were putting back were going to last a long time. So yeah, it is an ongoing dialogue, sort of day by day, week by week, lots of site visits. So yeah, working closely with the contractor and the specialist conservator was key to this, because it's not something that you can sort of do beforehand, and then the design was ongoing as it was being done.
Fab, thank you very much. I think I'm out of questions now. You can have the rest of your evening off.
Thanks, Max. I think that would be quite a good note to end it on. Just looking at the time. Thank you so much, Andy, for coming in. You've given such an informative talk about how you go about a project like this of this scale, with all of the constraints and restrictions, and then actually celebrate existing material as well as implementing new parts to it. So hopefully everyone's going to come away super inspired, and also just take away some of those key decision makings that you've highlighted within the Bath project into our own schemes. So thank you so much.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I can put my email in the chat. Happy to answer any more, but thanks for having me.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. Oh, before I forget, we have got, thank you for no one leaving, or many people, just before everyone goes, we have got Fem Week coming up next week. Is that not right?
That's right, yeah.
So starting as of Monday through to Friday, we have got a whole host of feminist talks, lectures with a host of external guests who are quite high up within the feminist world. So we're really excited about it. Please keep up to date with the emails that we'll be sending out on our social medias. But the big, having a big shout out on the Monday with the Feminist Library, with some really key speakers coming on for a discussion panel. And then again on the Friday, we've got another key speaker. So please come along. It will be a fab week, and the university has pushed the support as well for it. So yeah, thank you. Sorry to drop that in at the end, Andy, and I'll stop recording.